In November of 1911, on the Idaho side of the Owyhee country, a Basque shepherd woman named Iribarne did something that made every man on the road slow his team. She took the dirtiest wool in her shed and packed it into the walls of a house, not into a quilt, not into a mattress, into the walls. The fleece was belly wool, tag wool, black-tipped, dusty, heavy with lanolin, the kind a buyer pinched between two fingers and frowned at. To most of the valley, it was barely a product. To Ain, it was the thing winter itself had failed to understand. A wool broker named Nathaniel Corbin stopped beside the frame, with his ledger still tucked under one arm. Behind him, two ranchers leaned over a wagon board, watching Ain push handfuls of raw fleece into a double wall of willow ribs. The structure did not look like a cabin. It had 8 sides, a low roof, and a bent lattice skeleton that looked more like an overturned basket than a place where anyone would try to keep children alive through January. Corbin stared at the greasy wool disappearing into the wall. Then he said, "You seal that fleece in there. You'll pull out mold by spring. If it mats, I dock it. If it rots, I don't buy it at all." Ain kept working. A neighbor named Willis Cargill laughed and spat into the dirt. "First blue norther that comes down," he said, "that sheep basket will roll clear into Oregon." Ain did not answer him. She only shook the next armful of wool loose, the fibers blooming in the cold air, and tucked it into the hollow wall as gently as if she were putting a child to bed. Because Ain knew something none of them had priced. She knew wool did not keep a sheep alive because it was thick. It kept a sheep alive because it held still air. And before the winter was over, that little fact would make a mockery of every proper log cabin in the valley. Iribarne had not come to Idaho with any romance for the frontier. She had come with sheep. That was different. A frontier man might talk about land. A miner might talk about silver. A timberman might talk about straight pine and hard work. Ain measured a place by grass, wind, water, and how quickly weather could kill an animal that had made one small mistake. She had been born near the high Basque country, where stone huts sat half swallowed by hillside, and shepherds learned early that warmth was not always made by fire. Sometimes warmth was made by refusing the wind a path. Sometimes it was made by leaving air alone. When she was a girl, she had watched old shepherd stuff waste fleece into cracks between stones, not because they were poor, though they were, but because the material behaved better than rags, grass, or mud. Dirty wool held its loft. Grease kept the damp from soaking deep. The fibers tangled without collapsing. In Idaho, that memory became less like folklore and more like a plan. Her first winter in the Owyhee country had nearly broken that plan out of her by force. The cabin she and her brother had built was respectable by local standards. Cottonwood poles, mud chinking, a flat little iron stove, a plank door heavy enough to make a man feel he had done something serious. But cold does not respect effort. Cold respects physics. By late December, white frost grew inside the corners every morning. It feathered out from the log ends in delicate patterns, beautiful in the way a knife edge can be beautiful. Ain's daughter, Myron, slept in stockings, 2 skirts, and a coat buttoned to the throat. Her little ink bottle froze on the table. The cork lifted half an inch from the neck as the black liquid swelled into ice. One dawn, Ain found a pan of wash water frozen solid on the floor only 6 feet from the stove. Not overnight after a dead fire. During the morning, while embers still glowed under the ash, the chinking had cracked in the dry air. Every seam became a little mouth, When the wind came down out of the rimrock at 20 miles an hour, the cabin did not leak heat. It traded its whole breath for the outside air, again and again. The men blamed bad wood, bad luck, bad weather. So they cut more fuel. They cut until their hands split. They stacked juniper against the wall. They fed stoves through the night. They woke every 2 hours to keep fire in the iron, because the moment the flame fell back, the cold stepped in like it owned the room. Ain saw the problem differently. A log was solid. A solid thing carried heat straight through itself. The corners were worse. Each crossed end of timber became a bridge from the warm room to the frozen dark outside. Every cabin was proud of its corners. To Ain, those corners were wounds. By the next autumn, she had decided she would not build another box for the cold to enter. She would build something without a proper corner at all. The work began after shearing. When the hills had gone brown and the nights started biting the water buckets, Ain cut willow from the creek bottom and aspen from the draw. She did not look for the biggest poles. She wanted spring. She bent them into 8 low wall panels, then lashed a second ring inside the first, leaving a handspan and a half between them. Where a log cabin depended on weight, her frame depended on crossing tension. Each rib supported the next. Each lashing shared the load. It looked too delicate to the men who liked buildings that punished the earth under them. But when Ain leaned her shoulder into the frame, the whole thing flexed and held. Then she brought out the wool, not the cleanest locks, not the best shoulder fleece, not the sail clip Corbin wanted in tight sacks. She brought out the rough fleece, belly wool, tag ends, wind-knotted skirt wool, the pieces the market punished first. Corbin saw waste and risk. Ain saw crimp. She picked up a handful and pulled it apart so Myron could see the little waves in each fiber. "That is the trap," Ain said. "The air sits there. The cold cannot push all the way through." She did not pack the wool hard. That would have ruined it. She fluffed it, loosened it, and pressed it just enough that the wall cavity filled evenly. Too loose, and air could move. Too tight, and the fibers would crush into felt. The trick was a living middle. By sunset, the frame had begun to look like a strange pale animal crouched on the bench above the creek. By the end of the week, Ain had put nearly 360 pounds of raw wool into the walls and roof. The insulation was 12 inches thick in most places, thicker near the north face. Over the outer ribs, she stretched oiled canvas, stitched from wagon cover, and sheep camp tarp. Inside, she tacked up rough muslin and willow matting, so the children would not brush against loose fleece. The finished shelter was not pretty. It was low, round-shouldered, and stubborn-looking. It smelled faintly of sheep, willow sap, smoke, and oil. Willis Cargill said it looked like a haystack with a door. Nathaniel Corbin said nothing the second time he saw it. He only wrote something in his book, and Ain knew a man could make a threat look very official if he had paper in his hand. What Corbin did not understand was that his ledger had trained him to see wool after it left the animal. Ain understood wool before the market touched it. That was the difference. A wool fiber is not a thread of dead string. Under magnification, it is scaled, crimped, irregular, and springing against its neighbors. A mass of loose wool is mostly not wool at all. It is air, still air. In a properly fluffed fill, more than 90% of the volume can be trapped air pockets, broken into tiny spaces too small for a draft to organize itself. Heat has a hard time crossing that kind of maze. Conduction slows because the solid path is broken by fiber air. Convection slows because the air cannot roll and circulate. Radiation is weakened by layer after layer of irregular surface. And the lanolin, the very grease Corbin disliked, gave the system one more advantage. It made the fiber resist liquid water. Vapor could move slowly enough for the wall to breathe, but a little condensation did not instantly turn the insulation into a soaked rag. Ain had not studied any of this from a book. She had learned it from sheep that came off an icy ridge with snow on their backs and warmth still under the fleece. The numbers, if anyone in that valley had cared to calculate them, would have sounded impossible. A rough log wall might give less than 10 units of thermal resistance across its thickness. 12 inches of loose wool could reach something near the high 40s. The exact number did not matter to Ain. What mattered was the pan of water by the stove. What mattered was whether Myron could hold a pencil without mittens. What mattered was whether a mother could sleep through a whole night without waking to feed a fire like an animal. The test came in January. It came without drama at first. No great blizzard. No theatrical wall of snow, just a hard blue cold dropping out of Canada and settling into the high desert until everything alive seemed to move more slowly. For 9 mornings, the thermometer at the stage road showed below 0. For 3 of those mornings, it sat near 30 below. The air turned so dry that a cough felt like paper tearing in the chest. Fence wires sang. Harness leather went stiff as horn. A man's mustache froze white before he finished crossing a yard. The proper cabins became traps of smoke and frost. The Cargills burned nearly half a cord in 6 days. Their stove glowed red in the evening, but ice still filmed the water pail by dawn. Their smallest boy woke with frost on the blanket edge closest to the wall. At the Dunleavy place, the chinking opened so badly that Mrs. Dunleavy hung a quilt over the north wall. By morning, the quilt had frozen to the logs. Everyone was working. Everyone was burning. Everyone was losing ground. Inside on Iribarne's wool house, the little stove was lit once in the morning for coffee and porridge, then again at night for beans or bread. Between those times, it often sat black and cold. The shelter held at 62 degrees through the afternoon with no fire at all. At night, with 4 bodies, 1 oil lamp, and the heat left in the earthen floor, it stayed above 55 when the outside dark fell below 0. Not warm like a summer kitchen. Warm like a room that had stopped being afraid. Myron's ink bottle stayed liquid on a shelf against the north wall. That was the proof Ain trusted most. Not a thermometer. Thermometers could be questioned. A buyer could say one was hung wrong. A rancher could claim the stove had been burning when nobody saw it. But the ink told the truth. In the old cabin, it had frozen until the glass cracked. In the wool house, Myron dipped a pen into it every morning and wrote her letters at the table while the stove sat unlit. A child's alphabet became a better witness than any man in the valley. By the 10th day, word had reached Corbin. At first, he dismissed it as camp exaggeration. Sheep people, in his experience, made weather stories the way other men made rope, by twisting several thin strands until they seemed strong. But by March, when the thaw softened the track, he drove out himself. He expected 2 things: a proud woman too stubborn to admit a mistake, and a wall full of ruined wool. What he found was a house without smoke. No gray ribbon from the pipe, no hot iron smell, no frantic pile of split wood by the door. He knocked on the canvas flap with the back of his knuckles. Ain opened it, and warm air came out around her shoulders. Corbin actually stepped back. Inside, Myron was sitting at the table in a wool skirt and rolled sleeves, copying words from a school primer. Ains' brother, Tomas, was repairing a harness strap near the wall. The stove was cold enough that Corbin could see dust on the lid. He looked at it first because his mind needed the old answer. "Fire out?" he asked. "Since breakfast," Ains said. It was afternoon. Corbin walked in slowly, like a man entering a trick. The air was not damp. That bothered him most. A damp shelter he could have understood. A warm, damp shelter meant rot had only been postponed. But this room was dry. The wool smell was there. Yes, but clean and oily, not sour. The inner wall did not sweat. The corners, if they could even be called corners, had no frost. The children had not carved breath clouds into the air. Corbin set down his ledger. For the first time it looked useless. "Show me the wall," he said. Ain had built in small inspection ties, not for him, but because she wanted to know what the winter was doing inside her own work. She loosened one near the north side and pulled back the muslin. Corbin reached into the cavity. His face changed before his hand came out. He had expected cold grease, a dead mat. Wool collapsed into a slab. Instead, his fingers came back holding fleece that sprang open in his palm. Dry, elastic, still alive with crimp. The fibers had darkened with dust, but they had not rotted. They had not felted. They had not turned into the greasy brick he had promised. He pressed the wool between both hands and let it go. It expanded again. That small motion defeated him more completely than any argument could have. Ain watched him look from the fleece to the cold stove, from the cold stove to Myron's open ink bottle, from the ink bottle to the walls that had held off a killing cold with almost no fire. At last, Corbin said very quietly, "You did not waste your clip." Ain took the wool from his hand and tucked it back into the wall. "No," she said. "I let it do its first work." That sentence followed Corbin all the way back down the track. At the spring wool pool, he paid Ain full rate for the sail clip and asked too many questions about the house he had warned her not to build. How far apart were the ribs? How thick was the wool? Was the canvas tight to the fill, or did it stand off? Did she vent the smoke pipe through tin or clay? How much fuel had she burned compared with the Cargills? Ain answered the useful questions. She did not answer the ones that were really pride in disguise. By the next autumn, 2 more wool houses stood along the creek bottoms. They were not copies in every detail. One family used alder hoops. Another used split willow and a steeper roof. A third added a tiny mudroom, so snow would not blow straight into the sleeping space. But all of them kept the lesson. A double skin, no solid thermal bridge. Loose raw wool, never crushed. A windproof outer shell. Enough breath in the wall to stay dry. The idea spread not because it was fashionable, but because it solved the problem that had been eating every winter hour of their lives. Fuel mattered in sheep country. A day spent cutting wood was a day not spent repairing fence, doctoring lambs, moving feed, mending tack, or sleeping. Over 3 winters, Ain burned less than a third of what her first cabin had demanded. That was not a small saving. It was time returned to the family. It was fewer midnight trips into weather that could freeze skin. It was a child writing at a table instead of shivering under coats. And it was one more insult to the kind of expertise that mistakes a price for a truth. Corbin was not a fool. That is important. He knew wool grading. He knew staple length, grease weight, tenderness, burrs, color, and market appetite. He could look at a fleece and tell you what a mill might do with it before another man had finished opening the sack. But he knew wool as a commodity. Ain knew wool as a behavior. That was why he missed the shelter hidden inside the fleece. The sheep had been demonstrating the principle in front of everyone for as long as people had followed flocks into cold country. A living animal carried a loose, breathable, water-shedding wall around its body. The miracle was not mysterious. It was practical, repeatable, and quiet. Ain did not invent warmth. She noticed its shape. She saw that the best answer to a high desert winter was not always a thicker log or a hotter stove or a bigger woodpile. Sometimes the answer was a wall that behaved less like timber and more like an animal that already knew how to survive. Years later, people would give names to the things Owyhee had used by instinct: thermal breaks, dead air space, breathable wall assembly, rain screen, high-performance insulation. They would test them, specify them, diagram them, and sell them as modern knowledge. But in 1911, on a cold bench above an Idaho creek, Iribarne had only willow ribs, oiled canvas, raw fleece, and a memory from old stone huts across the ocean. She had a broker telling her she was ruining value. She had neighbors laughing at a house that looked too soft to last. And she had a child whose ink stayed liquid in January. That was enough, because the cold did not care who sounded most certain. It only cared which wall understood the work. Ain did not beat the winter by burning more. She made the house wear a sheep.